What's up, everybody? I'm Brandon LeCaren with Leverage for Legacy, and I'm so glad that you guys joined this challenge. I'm so excited to present to you guys with the construction opportunities that we're going to be going over today. And it's essentially a mini series that we wanted to do that kind of gives you a better idea on how to renovate a property. So we will essentially start with like how to break it down, and then we'll start getting into the nitty gritty, and then finally how do you essentially like procure contractors and materials and how to kind of negotiate. And again, it's just like a high level on and getting into it. So without further ado, let's jump in. So first of all, you have to understand how houses are built, right? And generally when you're dealing with properties, you have to understand what type of materials you're dealing with, right? So for someone in Florida, you're going to be dealing with a lot of concrete and stucco, whereas someone up north, like in Virginia where we're at, you're going to be dealing with a lot of wood construction and whatnot. So it's really important to understand what you're dealing with from the get-go, right? So that's going to determine how expensive or how cheap your project is going to be, or the type of contractors that you need to include when you're doing your walkthrough on these properties that you're bidding on, or whatever it might be. So the first step that I like to do when visiting a property is kind of just take a really good look of it outside, right? So I'll walk around the property and try to notice things that you wouldn't normally notice. So I'll walk up to the foundation and see if there's any cracks on the properties. Take a look at is there any mildew or any mold growing on the outside, because that's going to give a good indication of how well it was kept on the inside, as well as sometimes when you're looking at a building on the outside and you see a little crack going up and it's green or something, it kind of shows like, hey, there could be some moisture infiltration into the envelope of the building, and you want to kind of figure that out. So it kind of gives you a better understanding of what's going on from the outside before you jump in. Another thing that we look for is looking at the roof. So a lot of times it's really hard to get up on the roof, or you might have to like take a step back, right, and try to get a good eye on the roof, because if it's missing roof tiles, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take a closer look at that on the inside, right? So when I worked in construction, one of the biggest things that our job was mitigating water on buildings, or on commercial buildings. And essentially, like, we always had water consultants on our projects, and everybody that I was lucky enough to be able to pick their brain on and help understand what they're thinking about when they're putting together a skyscraper or a massive building. So water infiltration is probably the biggest threat to a building's life, right? Whether it's residential or commercial, it could threaten how long and how well the building stays in shape. So you want to make sure that you're mitigating water first of all, right? So I always start on the outside to look for these things. The next thing I look at is the windows, right? How do the windows look? Are they missing any screens? Are they missing caulking joints? And are they missing flashing, right? Flashing is that metal bit that goes around the window, and that kind of thing. Do you see any mold around the window on the outside? Because again, if you see mold on the outside, more than likely it's getting in on the inside. And sometimes it's a lot harder to tell whether it is mold on the inside, because it could be getting in between the walls, and you definitely don't want that. So I always look at those things to see what is the outside missing, what needs to be done before moving inside. So another thing I look at too is the drainage of the property itself. So how does the land slope away from the property? Because that's going to give you a better idea too of how much landscaping budget you need to allocate for a certain project. So we've covered building envelope, the siding, the roofing, the windows, any kind of caulking joints around the building, especially with stucco houses or brick houses. They generally have joints. And then another thing too is sometimes you can tell if there's any structural issues with the building, especially if they're brick, right? Because if brick kind of cracks all the way up, then there's going to be issues on the inside, or maybe issues with the foundation. And you want to understand those things. Now, there are two types of foundations. Speaking of foundations, usually they're slab on grade, or they have a basement / crawl space. So you want to figure out what type of foundation you have to kind of inspect it. So slab construction is going to be where everything is just on one level and then the house just goes up, versus a foundation where they dig down to create a level and then they build up from there. So That's what you want to understand, because the basement, obviously, if you have a basement in this house that you're looking at, you're not going to be able to tell if there's any cracks on the walls or if there's any issues. So again, that's going to tell you what you need to do when you go on the inside. So a lot of these things on the outside helps determine what you do on the inside. So once that's done, you've inspected the caulking joints, making sure there's no leaks in the building, making sure everything looks good, or maybe you documenting it and saying, I got to replace that window, I got to replace the roof, I got to replace that front door, I got to recaulk the entire house, I got to, repaint it, or whatever it might be. Then you can kind of start moving on the inside. Now with the inside, I like to move from the bottom floor and take it all the way to the top, right? And the reason for that is because, again, going back to that basement thing, you're going to be able to kind of tell if there are any issues with the foundation when you start in the basement and then you work your way up top. For instance, if the foundation is cracking, and it shows up in the basement, you want to try to follow that as you move up through the house to see if it's occurring again, right? So start in the basement and you start looking for moisture. So I walk around the perimeter of the basement and I start looking to see if there's any mold. Again, you want to make sure that there's no water infiltration coming into the building, or it's big money, and that's when things could get really expensive. So you want to make sure that you're doing a good job, because again, water is a killer of buildings, and water is also a killer of budgets, in my opinion. So you want to make sure that the projects is going to go well. So you walk around the perimeter of the house or property to make sure that there's no issues along the perimeter and there's no cracks, there's no water coming in, and that kind of stuff. Now, one of the indications that I look at too is what type of insects are there, right? So if there's any insects in the basement at all, which, I mean, there shouldn't be, to be honest. However, if there's any type of insects that likes moisture, then you can tell, hey, look, there could be a moisture issue down here. Or obviously if you see, microbial growth, that's a sign of moisture as well entering the building envelope. So those are just some tips for the basement. Again, obviously check the sump pump area. So the sump pump is that thing that, where around the perimeter of the house, there's a drain that goes around it, and this drain drains into a pit, right? It's like a round pit, and this stuff just gets pumped out. It gets ejected out to somewhere in your yard typically, or whatever, right? So you want to check that, make sure it's not working, make sure it's not full. If it's full and it, obviously it might not be working properly, what you could do is actually just reach down in that pit. Yeah, I know it sounds crazy, but reach down in that pit, and it works just like a toilet valve, and you're just going to kind of like trigger it and see if it triggers, and then it starts pumping the water out. Then that could also tell you whether or not it needs to be replaced, or if it's just sticking and it just needs to be cleaned up, because sometimes with these properties that's what happens, right? So if the HVAC system is on this floor, you want to take a look at that, inspect the age, look at the inside, obviously have a qualified HVAC contractor look at it. And then next thing we'll look at is the age of the water heater. Water heater ages typically last around, 10 years, 8 to 15 if you're like really pushing it and if you're taking good care of it. HVAC ages generally last about 15 to 20 years. However, I've seen them go for 30, 40, 50 years, okay? So just because something is old doesn't mean it has to be replaced. It's how you take care of things is what's important to the life cycle of that thing, right? And then as you're walking through the basement, just keep an eye out again for insects, if there's any microbial growth around the foundation and whatnot. Then you're going to start moving your way up. So move your way up to the second floor. Again, if there were any cracks on the basement, follow that up and make sure that it doesn't continue up or whatever, right? Or it could give you a good indication of what's going on with the foundation. So as you move up to your second floor, or maybe first floor if it's slab on grade, you want to make sure that there's no, again, water in the ceiling. So now you're starting to look up instead of looking from the bottom, like bottoms up. You're going to look top down, right? So you want to make sure that there's no water coming through the ceiling. You're going to want to make sure that there's no, missing vents. And if the vents are dirty, you're going to start looking for these things, right? Because water, again, is a killer, right? So if water is coming through, you're going to want to follow that again to the next level, right? So that's how it kind of builds on each other. And you're on this level, you're essentially just looking, again, mainly for the windows, doors, see how they look on the inside, checking for microbial growth around the windows, and just, again, documenting every single thing. And in our next video, we're going to definitely get into how you document those things and how I document them and how we estimate them, really. So again, this is just you just going around the property to kind of get an idea of what you're dealing with, so you know the type of people you need to bring in to look at it and start bidding the work. So as you look at the windows, you're going to look at the kitchen if it's on this level. Open up the cabinets on all of the cabinets that have sinks. Check if there's any leaks under the sink, because that's typically where it does occur. Check the refrigerator. If the refrigerator is in good shape, you generally, if you're buying the properties we're buying, you're going to want to replace all of that, right? So essentially, you want to make sure that everything is really well taken care of, or at least you're documenting or have an idea of what you need to replace as you go through. So typically we do new appliance packages when you're going through the kitchen or the entire house, that kind of thing. But you still want to open up the cabinets and make sure there's no leaks on the properties and whatnot. As you're working your way up into the bedrooms and whatnot, you're going to want to look again at the windows, make sure there's no broken stuff, broken hardware, or maybe there's window pieces missing. Sometimes the floors are damaged, that kind of stuff. Again, you're just mainly looking at bigger stuff. And let's say you're on the top floor where the roof kind of the next level up is the roof. You want to start looking at the corners of the house, right? So as you're looking at these corners, generally that's where moisture kind of comes in. Water will come in through corners, path of least resistance, and they kind of just sit there. So you want to make sure that when you're going through these properties that you're looking at every nook and cranny and every corner to make sure that water is not coming in, so you don't have to mitigate that right away. Again, you're going to look at the bathrooms and make sure there's no leaks in the bathrooms. Checking the master bathrooms, and just kind of get a good idea, a good feel for the house. Look at the floors, again, look at the ceiling and that kind of stuff. If it has an attic, you want to go up there and double check that no one cut any roof trusses or joists to do any kind of funky renovations. Make sure that any of the penetrations on the roof are going straight through and you can't see any daylight through it, like no light comes through. You want to make sure that you don't see any leaks, any water stains on the sheathing on the inside. You want to make sure that all these things are it's not crazy, right? And it's not super wet and whatnot. So there you have it. That's first phase. Just get a good idea of what you're looking at, what's required on the property to get a better understanding of the gist of it, right? Because maybe it's something that you don't even want to deal with. Maybe you just want a new construction like Valencia. But, maybe you're like me and you're like, I just want a dirty property to renovate and do a serious value add. So there you have it. Next up, we're going to cover exactly how to start estimating these things and what formulas I use to start estimating. I think you guys will learn a lot. I hope to see you guys on the next video, and I'll see you then. Take care.